The morning the banker's men came to collect the debt, the temperature had already dropped below freezing, and Elsa's threadbare wool stockings offered almost no barrier between her skin and the cold that rose from the earth with a kind of persistent hunger. She stood in the yard of the homestead, the only place she had ever truly called home, and felt the north wind move through the gaps in her shawl and find her collarbone without any difficulty at all, settling there like a hand that had no intention of moving. The frost had come early that October, much earlier than the old-timers had predicted, and it lay across the prairie grass in a thin white veil that looked almost delicate until you realized it would not melt until spring. The banker was a small man with a face like a fist, liver spots on his temples, and a voice that carried the kind of certainty that only money could purchase. Behind him stood the debt collector, a larger man whose purpose seemed to be simply to exist in the space between Elsa and her own house, to occupy that buffer zone of possibility. The papers had been signed months ago, before Thomas died, back when he still believed the wheat would come in at a good price and the livestock would multiply as God intended. But the wheat had failed, the livestock had gotten sick, and then Thomas had gotten sick, and no amount of prayer or poultice or whispered bargaining with forces beyond her reach had changed the fact of his death. She had buried him herself, with help from the Reverend's wife, in the small cemetery on the rise north of town, where the wind never stopped blowing. 4 months ago now, she had worn the black dress to the funeral, the one her mother had made for her wedding day all those years back. Back when she and Thomas were both young enough to believe that hard work and good intentions were enough to anchor a life to something permanent, the Reverend's wife had patted her hand and said that the Lord never gives us more than we can bear, which struck Elsa as either profoundly true or profoundly stupid, and she had never been able to decide which. The banker gestured with papers that moved in his hands like living things. He spoke of interest accruing and mortgages in arrears and her status as a widow, without issue, without male guardianship, without the means to maintain the property. He spoke the words in a tone that suggested he was not the bearer of bad news, but simply the voice of mathematics, the messenger of the irrefutable. When he finished, he folded the papers and placed them in his coat pocket, as if the act of storing them there might somehow make them more real, more binding, more true. Elsa had nodded. She had not argued. There was nothing to argue with. The facts were the facts. The crops had failed, the debt was real, and she had no money. She owned nothing that could be converted into currency except the clothes on her back and the oil lantern that had belonged to her father, and that was not enough. It would never be enough. By midday, they had loaded her few possessions into a cart, the quilt she had stitched by firelight, the tin dishes, the cast-iron skillet, the books, 2 of them, a Bible and a collection of poetry her mother had given her, the spinning wheel that had belonged to Thomas's mother, the chickens in a woven crate. They left her with these things, and a kind of permission to be gone by sundown. She had nowhere to go, no family, no close friends who had the means to harbor her, and even if they had, to do so would be to invite the banker's attention to them, would be to place a mark on their own households. She understood this without needing it explained. It was in the late afternoon that Mrs. Hargrove had appeared at the fence line, bonnet perfectly arranged despite the wind, dress pressed and buttoned to the throat. She had come with her daughter, a thin, pale girl of about 16, who looked almost as uncomfortable as Elsa felt. Mrs. Hargrove had made a small performance of sympathy, a theatrical display of concern that seemed calculated to draw the attention of the other neighbors who had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle of a woman being unmade, as if witnessing such a thing might somehow protect them from its possibility. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Hargrove had said, her voice pitched high enough to carry across the yard. What a dreadful situation. Poor Thomas, poor Thomas, to leave you in such a state. The words were offered with a smile that did not reach her eyes, a smile that seemed to contain within it a kind of satisfaction, as if the wreckage of Elsa's life was a piece of news so interesting that it barely mattered that Elsa herself was present to hear it. You simply must tell me if there is anything at all, that my husband and I might do to help. We do so pride ourselves on our Christian charity, don't we, Margaret? The daughter had nodded, her face flushed, and something in that small motion of assent had made it clear that even the child understood that this was not charity being offered, but sport, not generosity, but entertainment. Mrs. Hargrove had stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, managing to extract from the assembled neighbors a kind of collective commiseration that somehow served only to amplify their distance from her, to mark her as other, as fallen, as the object of their pity and fascination. When the banker's men were gone and the sun had slipped below the horizon and the temperature had begun its nightly plunge, Elsa had gathered what she could carry. She had tied the quilts into a bundle. She had filled a canvas sack with the tin dishes and the skillet and the small store of beans and flour that remained. The lantern she had hung from the crook of her arm, a brass thing that caught the last light like a small sun. She had left the spinning wheel and the books and most of the chickens for whoever came next, for the banker to sell or to keep or to leave to the mercy of the weather. She had taken only what she could carry, which turned out to be almost nothing at all. She had walked north from the homestead as the stars emerged, walking away from the town lights, walking toward the darkness of the open land. She had walked for hours, her breath making clouds in the freezing air, her stockings wet with morning dew that had turned to ice, her feet beginning to go numb in the worn leather boots. The wind had not stopped. It had only grown more insistent, more thorough in its examination of every gap and seam in her clothing. She had walked and walked until the lights of town had disappeared behind the rises and the land had opened up into something vast and indifferent and utterly without mercy. It was past midnight when she found the limestone cave. She had not been looking for it. She had been walking simply to walk, to put distance between herself and the place she had been dispossessed from, to move away from the pity and the condescension and the weight of other people's certainty about what her life meant. The cave mouth had appeared suddenly in the darkness, revealed by a shift in the starlight or by some instinct in her that recognized shelter when she was near it. It was perhaps 10 feet wide at the opening, and the limestone arch above it was smooth and pale, almost luminous in the starlight. She had raised the lantern, and the light had traveled into the darkness of the cave, illuminating walls of cream and gray stone, formations of mineral deposits that looked like frozen waterfalls, like the accumulated history of centuries of water moving through rock. The air coming from the cave was cool, but not brutally cold, and it carried with it the mineral smell of stone and water and things very old. She had stepped inside without thinking, driven by an instinct older than reason, by the body's simple knowledge that shelter meant survival. The cave extended back further than she could see. The light from the lantern threw shadows against the walls and made the formations seem to move, to shift, as if the cave itself was alive and breathing. She had walked deeper, and the darkness had pulled away before the light like a living thing, and the sound of her footsteps had echoed off the stone, returning to her transformed by the space, by the vastness of it, by the absolute silence that lay beneath the sound. And then, deeper still, she had heard water, not the roar of a river, but the steady, soft sound of water moving. and she had followed that sound as if it were a call. The cave opened into a larger chamber, perhaps 40 feet back from the entrance. The water was there, a small underground spring flowing from the base of the limestone wall, pooling into a basin that nature had carved over countless years, and filling it with water so clear that the bottom was visible even by lantern light. The spring emerged cold and pure, and Elsa had knelt there and drunk deeply, the water so cold it made her teeth ache, and never in her life had water tasted so clean, so absolutely necessary and free. The chamber had a high ceiling, rough stone overhead that disappeared into darkness that even the lantern could not reach. There was a shelf of smooth, dry stone, rising perhaps 5 feet above the water line, broad enough to lie on, flat enough to be used for purposes other than sleeping. The air moved through the chamber in a way that suggested ventilation, some opening or crack that allowed air to circulate, and she had traced the movement of it and found a fissure in the ceiling where a draft moved steadily upward. A natural chimney, she had realized, a place where smoke might go. Elsa Brannock stood in the cave's throat and felt the stone speak in its oldest language. The limestone pale as ancient bone beneath her fingertips, carved by water that had moved through these chambers for 10,000 years or more, patient and relentless as prayer. And she traced with her calloused palm the evidence of that patient work, the smooth hollows worn into the walls, the flutings that ran vertically like the folds of curtains hanging in some god's austere room, and the colors emerged as her lantern light moved across them, cream and ivory in the main passages where the stone lay relatively pristine, but deeper where the water had worked its alchemy, rust-red streaks bled through the matrix like old blood, iron oxides trapped in the rock for centuries, and in the western-facing alcove above her head ran veins of gray-blue mineral that caught and threw back her light in glimmers that seemed to pulse with their own small luminescence. The calcite or feldspar or whatever geological fortune had placed them there, working with the flame to create a shimmer like water, reflecting moonlight. She moved deeper into the space, her breath visible in the cold air, the temperature dropping perceptibly as she descended, the limestone acting as an insulator, keeping the cave colder than the autumn forest above. And this cold felt clean, purposeful, uninfected by rot or decay, and somewhere in the distance, that distance she had not yet measured, she heard the faint percussion of water on stone, the spring's endless work continuing in the darkness, and she followed that sound with increasing confidence, her boots finding purchase on the worn path through the limestone passage without conscious direction, and she knew then that her body was beginning to learn the geography of this place, was beginning to inhabit it in the way that animals inhabited their territories, through repetition and incremental memory, and she carried each load with her arms close to her body, keeping the container stable against her hips. And when she emerged into the chamber where the spring pooled and spilled, the lantern light caught something unexpected, a side passage, narrow and low-ceilinged, branching off at an oblique angle, the opening perhaps 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, leading into a darkness that her light could not pierce, and she crouched and examined it, found the stone here rougher, less shaped by water, more angular, and the air that came from that passage was even colder, carrying the particular dryness of a sealed space, and she thought immediately of storage. This could be her winter larder, her root cellar, the passive thermodynamics of the Earth's interior providing what no man-made structure could match, and she made a mental note of its position relative to the spring, already calculating how she might organize the goods she would need to gather before the snows came, the mushrooms and tubers, the grains she could forage or barter for. and she returned to the main chamber and stood quietly, letting her ears adjust to the particular acoustics of the space, discovering that sound here did not carry as it did in the open air, but rather seemed to be absorbed by the stone, dampened and contained, so that even her footsteps, which should have echoed, instead produced only a muted percussion that died almost immediately, and she realized this meant the space would be a sanctuary from wind noise, from the shrieking of winter gales that would race down from the high country. And she raised her voice in a low hum, watching as the sound seemed to flatten and disappear, as if the stone itself were listening but refusing to answer back. And she found this comforting in a way she could not articulate, this refusal of the cave to amplify her loneliness, to throw it back at her in the form of echoes and reverberations that would only deepen her sense of isolation. And she began to move through the main chamber again, her lantern held high, watching as the light caught the scattered mineral deposits embedded in the limestone, small quartz crystals and feldspar fragments that threw back the flame in miniature starbursts. And she understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost religious, that this cave was not empty space, not a mere hole in the earth, but a presence, an entity that had been waiting for her in the darkness, had been formed by forces that cared nothing for human need, but which aligned nonetheless with her own desperate requirements. And she sat down on a smooth stone near the spring and began to weep, not from despair, but from the overwhelming gratitude of a creature who had stumbled, half blind, into exactly what she needed to survive. She had sat there in the darkness, in the shelter of the stone, in this place that had been formed over the course of millions of years, and she had understood that she had found what she needed, not what she wanted, but what she needed. A place out of the wind, a place with water, a place where the earth itself offered shelter, where the stone had already done the work of protection. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky outside the cave mouth, Elsa had made her decision. This would be where she lived. This cave, this shelter, this place that the limestone had offered. She had gathered dry wood that had blown into the cave entrance, branches and pieces of deadfall that had collected in the mouth during previous storms. She had arranged them in a careful pile on the shelf above the waterline. She had used flint and steel from the kit in her apron pocket to strike a spark, and when the spark caught in dried moss and small twigs, she had nursed the flame upward until it became a real fire, small but real, burning on stone in the darkness. The smoke had risen, and most of it had traveled upward through the natural fissure she had identified, leaving only enough behind to add a kind of sweetness to the air, a kind of presence. She had fed the fire small twigs, and then larger branches, and the heat had begun to spread outward from that small center, warm in the stone around it, warm in her own body, warm in the air of the cave in a way that was almost miraculous. She had sat there through that first morning, watching the fire burn, watching the light from it dance on the walls of the cave, and she had understood that she was no longer the object of anyone's pity. She had become something else entirely. She had become the woman who lived in the cave. The town had begun to notice within days, not all at once, but gradually, in the way that small towns notice everything. Elsa had made trips into town for supplies, had bartered the eggs from the chickens she had managed to bring with her, had sold one of the quilts to the dry goods merchant for coin. She had been careful and methodical, had spoken to no one more than necessary, had ignored the whispers that she was aware followed her through the streets. It was Mrs. Hargrove who had given the thing a name. The cave woman, she had called her, her voice carrying across the general store with the kind of satisfaction that came from having found exactly the right insult. That's what Thomas's widow has become, a cave woman digging into the hillside like some sort of animal, making her lair in the earth. Dreadful, simply dreadful. Elsa had heard this, had felt it land on her like something physical, and had chosen to do nothing at all about it. She had paid for her salt and her flour and her candles, and had walked out of the store with her purchases held close. Had walked back out of town toward the cave that was beginning to feel more like home than any place she had ever known. She understood what Mrs. Hargrove was doing, was making a story that elevated herself through the diminishment of someone else, was creating a narrative in which Elsa's desperate survival became proof of Elsa's essential oddness, her essential wrongness, as if poverty were not a circumstance, but a character flaw, as if the loss of everything were evidence of some moral failing rather than simple bad luck and the indifference of an economic system that had no use for widows. She had ignored the mockery because she was too busy to do otherwise. The cave required work, constant work. Work in the early mornings and through the afternoons and in the evenings when the light began to fail. She had needed to gather dead wood from the creek beds that ran through the limestone country, pieces of cottonwood and sage that had fallen and dried and could be carried back to the cave and arranged for burning. The gathering itself was meditative in a way that nothing else had ever been. The bending and lifting, the sorting of wood that was truly dry from wood that only looked dry, the understanding that each piece of deadfall might be the difference between warmth and cold on some future night when the wind came down from the north, with nothing but hunger in it. She had spent days hauling stones from the creek bed, dragging them one by one back to the cave, selecting the flattest ones to serve as a sleeping platform on the stone shelf above the waterline. The work had been repetitive and almost painless in its repetition. Lift, carry, place. Lift, carry, place. Her hands had begun to bleed where blisters opened and the stone abraded against skin. She had wrapped strips of cloth torn from her own petticoat around her palms, and she had continued. The cold had kept the blisters from becoming infected. The work had become a kind of prayer, wordless and complete in itself. She had fashioned a door from fallen timber and rawhide, lashing the pieces together with strips of leather she had salvaged from her old work boots, creating a barrier that could be wedged into the cave mouth to keep out the worst of the wind while still allowing some air circulation. The rawhide had been treated with grease from the few rabbits she had managed to trap, which meant that the door had a smell to it, but the smell mattered less than the function. She carried the water in a container she had fashioned from bark, stripped from a young birch and sealed at the seams with clay that she had found in a cut bank near the stream's mouth. And this vessel, though crude and prone to small leaks that she constantly repaired, held perhaps 3 gallons when filled to the brim, and she made the journey from cave to spring to cave again, in a rhythm that became almost meditative, her boots finding the worn path through the limestone passage without conscious direction. And she knew then that her body was beginning to learn the geography of this place, was beginning to inhabit it in the way that animals inhabited their territories, through repetition and incremental memory. And she carried each load with her arms close to her body, keeping the container stable against her hips, and the water was so cold that even through the bark layers her skin grew numb, and when she finally had enough to fill the clay bowl she had positioned near the door, she sat down and held her hands under running water, letting the cold work out the stiffness, the cramp, the dull ache that had begun to establish itself in her shoulders and lower back. The doorframe had warped in the wind, and she found that she needed to pack mud mixed with long strands of grass and moss around the edges where the air was leaking through. And she worked at this patiently, using her fingers to force the material into the gaps, working from bottom to top so that gravity assisted her. And she found that the repetitive motion of pushing, packing, smoothing was soothing in a way that her mind needed. Something to focus on that was neither past nor future, but purely present. And when she had sealed the worst of the leaks, she stood back to examine her work and found it passable, not perfect, but sufficient. And she thought about how the concept of sufficiency had shifted entirely since she had come to this place. How what would have seemed laughably inadequate in her father's house now represented a genuine accomplishment. Near the cave entrance, where the light fell strongest in the late afternoon, she discovered a patch of wild sage growing in a crevasse of the limestone, its silvery green leaves dense and fragrant, and she understood immediately that this was a gift of circumstance, that sage could be dried for tea or for cooking, could extend the flavor of bland foods, could aid in digestion, and she began carefully harvesting the outer sprigs, leaving the root system intact, and she hung these on a piece of cord that she strung across the cave entrance, allowing the air to dry them, and she found herself checking on them several times a day, turning them, ensuring they dried evenly. And this small act of cultivation, of deliberate preservation, gave her a sense of agency that had been absent from her life for months, and she made a simple broom from twigs she gathered near the cave entrance, binding them together with strips of bark, and she swept the cave floor, beginning at the deepest recesses and working toward the entrance. And the repetitive motion of the broom across stone was hypnotic, the soft sound of bristles on mineral surface creating a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. And she swept until the loose debris, the silt, the small stones, the dried bat guano that had accumulated in the deepest corners, was pushed toward the entrance and then outside, and when she was finished, the floor gleamed with dampness, and she thought about how cleaning was a kind of renewal, how the act of making a space clean was also the act of claiming it, and she found a deposit of white chalk on the eastern wall of the cave, a band of it perhaps 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, and she scratched at it with a piece of bone and found it soft, yielding, perfect for marking, and she used it to score horizontal lines at various heights, one at her own shoulder height, one at her waist, one at knee level. And these marks became measurements, became a way of quantifying the space she inhabited, and she found that knowing the dimensions of her domain, even in these rough scratched lines, made the cave feel less like a void and more like a room, like a place that could be known and ultimately mastered. By the time the first real snow came in November, Elsa had created a space that was arguably habitable. The fire was burning more efficiently. The smoke rose properly through the natural chimney. The sleeping platform of stacked stones was lined with the quilts she had brought, and they created a barrier against the cold that radiated upward from the earth. She had even managed to construct a kind of shelf from flat stones balanced on other stones, creating a place to store the supplies she had gathered, the flour and salt, the beans, the dried jerky she had made from the last of the chickens before the winter cold had made meat preservation possible without effort. The townspeople continued to watch. She could feel it in the way they fell silent when she walked past them on the street, in the way Mrs. Hargrove would position herself to be seen, dressed in her finest, offering her condolences and her charity to other women in tones calculated to carry. The mockery had a weight to it, a substantiality, but Elsa had learned something in the cave that the town could not touch. She had learned that survival was not a matter of what other people thought. Survival was a matter of stone and water and fire. Survival was something that required only that she continue to move, to work, to make the necessary adjustments to the space she inhabited. It was in late November, when the first blizzard had come down from Canada, with a ferocity that stopped all commerce and travel and left the entire territory locked in white, that Elsa had begun work on the hearth that would become the true center of her underground life. She had gathered clay from a deposit near the spring, had mixed it with wood ash from her fires, had begun the careful, deliberate work of building a proper stone fireplace. Each rock was selected for its shape, its weight, its willingness to hold a position against the force of gravity and time. Each rock was placed with precision, bedded in the clay ash mortar, nudged into perfect alignment with its neighbors. The work was slow. The mortar had to cure between layers. The stones had to be tested, tapped, understood in their individual natures before they could be trusted to hold the heat that a real fire would generate. She had worked for hours each day, her hands becoming calloused and shaped to the work, her back learning the particular angle of bending and lifting, her mind settling into the rhythm of it. Place, test, adjust, move forward. Place, test, adjust, move forward. The hearth had begun to take shape, rising from the stone floor of the cave like a second heart, a place where warmth could be generated and controlled and used. By December, the hearth was complete, and she had begun the construction of the oven that would be built onto the face of it. This was more complex, more demanding. The oven required a dome, an arch that would focus heat downward and create the environment necessary for bread to rise and brown. She had gathered more clay, more small stones. She had fashioned a form from dead wood, creating a temporary arch that would support the stones and clay until they cured hard enough to support themselves. She had begun to build, stone by stone, curve by curve, understanding with each placement that she was creating not just a functional structure, but a kind of stability, a kind of permanence in a world that had made it clear that permanence was a luxury purchased only by those with money. The first snow fell thickly outside the cave mouth while she worked, the world beyond her shelter becoming white and indifferent. She could hear the wind, but it did not touch her. She could feel the cold trying to penetrate her clothing, but it found no purchase here, in the earth, in the stone, in the space she had claimed and was reshaping with her own hands. The oven grew under her careful attention, day by day, stone by stone, until finally, after weeks of work, it was complete enough to test. She had built the fire in the hearth on a cold December morning, had watched the smoke rise through the constructed chimney, had felt the heat radiate from the stones and warm the entire chamber of the cave. The oven had held the heat. The temperature inside it had risen until it was too hot to touch, and she had understood in that moment that she had done something significant. She had not simply survived. She had created. The work of the oven took her into late summer, each day a repetition of the last in the way that building requires. Measure, mix, shape, fire, measure again. She fashioned bricks from clay. She dug from a bank near the spring, kneading it with her bare feet as she stood in the shallow depression she'd created, the mud cool and yielding between her toes. Her skirts were bound up with cord. Her hair was bound with twine. This was not the work of a woman who cared what the town might imagine. She mixed straw into the clay, handfuls of dried grass to bind the brick as it dried, and she shaped them one by one against the wooden frame she'd constructed, a semicircle of ash wood, carefully curved, that would become the dome's skeleton. 200 bricks, each the size of her fist, each pressed and smoothed by hands that were no longer soft. She laid them to dry in the sun along the cave's floor, turning them daily so the heat would cure them evenly, and the work became meditative in its sameness. Brick, turn it, set it down, begin again. When the bricks had hardened to a pale tan, almost bone-colored in the late light, she began to build the oven proper, using the river clay mixed with sand as mortar, pressing each brick into place with a mason's care she had learned from watching Thomas build the chimney of their lost homestead. The memory of his hands moved through her own hands as she worked, and she did not resist this. She built the base first, a circular floor of larger stones fitted tight as a puzzle, sloped slightly toward a drainage channel she dug so water would not pool. Then the dome rose, brick by brick, each one angled inward until the arch formed, self-supporting in the way that arches were built to be, and the mathematics of it, the geometry of survival, sang in her hands. The oven mouth she left as an opening barely large enough to thrust her arms through, and above the mouth she built a chimney of smaller bricks that rose through a natural fissure in the cave ceiling. And when she sealed the final brick and stepped back and saw what she had made, she sat on her heels in the gray dust and did not allow herself to weep. The first firing took all of one dawn and afternoon. She packed the oven full of split wood and kindled it slowly, watching the temperature climb through the bricks, seeing the color change from gray to tan to a faint blush of heat, and she kept the fire burning until the dome was nearly white with heat and her face felt as though the skin might separate from the bone. Then she let it cool through the evening, letting the bricks absorb the heat thoroughly, and the next morning she mixed flour she had ground by hand with a flat stone and water from the spring, and she made a simple dough, no yeast, but the wild ferment from the flour itself, the long, slow rise of natural things, and she shaped it into a loaf. Her hands remembered the shape. A woman's hands carry memory deeper than the mind. She slid the loaf into the oven using a wooden peel she'd carved from a length of ash, and the heat met her face as the door opened, a great exhalation of warmth, and she worked quickly because the bread demanded it. The oven closed around it, and she sat back and waited. The smell began within minutes, not the burnt smell of bread cooked over fire, but something else, something finer, a scent that carried in it the whole history of human bread, the fermented grain, the transforming heat, the ancient knowledge that flour and water and time could become something that sustained. The aroma rose through the cave, through the fissure that had become her chimney, and it drifted down the hillside toward the town that had not invited her to stay. When the bread emerged, it was deep brown and singing, literally singing, the crust cracking with small sharp sounds as it cooled, and when she broke it open, the steam rose and the crumb was golden and tender, and she could taste the faint sweetness of the long ferment. And she understood then that she would not starve, that she could make what she needed. That survival was not a thing granted by others, but a thing built with her own hands, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, with the same patience that had brought her into this world and would carry her out of it. She built shelves from split timber she laboriously cut from fallen trees, splitting them with cunning and wedge and hammer, dragging each length back to the cave on a sled she'd fashioned from branches and rope. The shelves went up in neat rows along the walls, level and true, and her tools became extensions of her will. The level, the square, the saw, the hammer. And with each shelf, she was building not storage, but a declaration. This is my space. This is ordered. This is mine. She built a platform for sleeping that was higher than the original crude frame, and she stitched a mattress from canvas using a bone needle and thread made from unraveled grain sacks. And she stuffed it with clean straw and dried grass, and over it she arranged quilts she had sewn from scraps of fabric she'd traded her labor for. A patch of calico here, a square of wool there, stitched through cold evenings by lantern light until the quilts were thick and warm and patterned in shades of rust and cream and deep blue. She hung the quilts with iron hooks she'd hammered herself, and the sleeping platform became a bed, a real bed, something that said she was not an animal in a den, but a woman in a home. Through the long summer and into the turning of the seasons, she began the true work of preservation, the work that would determine whether she lived or died when the cold came down. She walked the hillsides in early morning, her apron tied at the waist to serve as a basket, and she gathered wild onions, their papery skins and sharp green tops emerging from the rocky soil, and she gathered them by the bagful and brought them to the cave to dry. She made clay jars in the manner of the potters she had once seen at a traveling fair, coiling clay upward in spirals, smoothing it with wet hands, shaping the mouth and the rim, and she fired these jars in the oven between baking days, and they emerged hard and sealed and perfect for storage. She had learned from necessity. She had learned from watching. She had learned from the understanding that there was no one coming to help her, and so all the knowledge she needed lived already in her hands. The turnips came up purple and bulbous from the ground, and she dug them with a stick, cleaning them carefully, laying them out to dry for a day in the sun before she brought them in and began the work of preservation. She cut them into thin coins, and she laid these coins on flat stones near the hearth where the heat was dry and constant, and over the course of a week they shrank and hardened into something that would never rot, never spoil, and she stored them in sealed jars on her shelves. Berries came next, wild raspberries growing in thorny tangles near the creek, and she picked them until her hands bled from the thorns and her apron was stained dark red with their juice. She did not make preserves in the town manner, with sugar that she could not afford. Instead, she spread them on flat stones to dry in the sun, and they became concentrated, intense, wrinkled like old skin, but retaining their sweetness, and she stored them in jars sealed with cloth tied at the top. Mushrooms she gathered with great care, knowing which ones carried poison and which ones carried sustenance. The knowledge filtering down from women who had come before her, and she dried these, threaded on twine, hanging them from the ceiling in bundles that looked, in the lantern light, like strange fruit. The stone wall to her left gleamed with mineral veins when she held her lantern close, and in the third week she discovered what she was searching for, a seam of salt crystals crusted into the limestone like frozen tears, accessible if she widened the cavity with her mattock and hands. She spent 2 mornings breaking apart the deposits, collecting the rough chunks in a canvas sack, and though her palms blistered and her fingernails darkened with mineral dust, she understood the mathematics of preservation. Salt meant meat would not rot, meant she could build a larder that would sustain her through months when the hunting grew thin. She crushed the crystals against a flat stone, ground them to granules fine enough to cake onto strips of venison she had draped over a frame of saplings above the hearth, where the smoke from burning hickory wood, green branches that smoldered rather than flamed, rose in pale clouds that tasted of bitter and sweet when she inhaled too close. The wood was deliberate. Dry wood burned too hot and too fast, but the green hickory produced a slow smoke that turned the meat the color of mahogany and sealed it against time itself. She rotated the strips every few hours, feeling the surface grow taut and leather-like beneath her fingertips, watching how the smoke wound through the cave like something living, filling the space with a smell so thick it coated the back of her throat and clung to her hair and clothes. In the corner where the spring emerged from the earth, cold and relentless, she carved at the limestone with a chisel and hammer, widening a natural alcove until it was large enough to store wrapped packages of meat and earthen jars of rendered tallow. The air there never rose above 40 degrees, even when the outside world burned with summer heat, because the water that seeped from the spring originated in some deep place where the sun never reached, and the cave ceiling deflected the warmth of her hearth away from that corner, creating a pocket of permanent winter. She rendered the tallow from the fat of the deer and elk she butchered, melting it slowly in iron pans until the impurities sank to the bottom, and the pure fat rose clear and golden, then pouring it into hollowed rushes and smooth sticks of wood, so she might have candles that would burn for hours, shedding a light that was not as pure as wax, but far superior to sitting in darkness. The tallow also waterproofed things. She rubbed it into her boots and into strips of canvas, smearing it across the seams of her clothing so that rain would not penetrate, so that the moisture that dripped from the cave ceiling in places would not rot the fabric from her skin. The work was ceaseless and rhythmic and meditative, and she moved through the cave like a figure in a painting that showed all the hours at once, folding herbs she had dried, sage and yarrow and the pale leaves of medicinal plants she had learned by trial, into cloth pouches that hung from the ceiling, layering meat in salt and smoke, pouring tallow into molds, checking and rechecking the temperature of her storage alcove by pressing her forehead against the stone and feeling how the cold radiated outward like an invisible wall. The smells accumulated and deepened, the earthiness of salt and limestone mixing with the bittersweet smoke of green hickory, with the rich animal smell of tallow warming in pans, with the clean herbaceous green of dried plants, with the iron mineral smell of the water that ran perpetually from the spring, with her own sweat, and the smoke that had worked itself into the fibers of her clothing until she carried the cave's scent with her everywhere. Over the course of weeks, the space transformed from a shelter into something more intentional, more constructed, more hers. The walls took on the patina of use, darkened by smoke in certain areas, crystallized with salt spray in others, organized now into zones of function and purpose. The hearth at the center, like a heart that beat with warmth and light. The storage alcove, cool and patient, at the periphery. The sleeping space elevated on branches and covered with every hide she had acquired. The work area where she sat cross-legged, grinding herbs or wrapping meat, or pouring tallow arranged with the implements she had fashioned from bone and stone and salvaged metal. This was not mere survival anymore. This was building something, creating order in the chaos of a hostile landscape, writing her intention onto the face of the earth and the walls of this cave in the languages of smoke and salt and labor. She traded her labor for supplies she could not forage. Her hands that had been soft a year ago had become instruments of work, calloused and strong, and she used them to split wood for the widow Calloway, the only soul in Dresden who had shown her kindness, the only woman who had come to the cave with her hands full of food and her mouth closed against judgment. For these hours of splitting, wood for the widow's stove, stacked neat and true, she received sacks of wheat still in the chaff, and she spent nights winnowing this wheat by candlelight, pouring it from one cloth to another in the draught from the cave mouth, letting the wind take the chaff while the grain fell to the cloth below. She ground this wheat between two flat stones she'd taken from the creek bed, smoothing them against each other in a circular motion until the grain became flour, and it took hours of work to process enough for a single loaf. and she did it gladly. She received eggs from a farmer whose fence she mended, and she carefully stored these in clay with a coating of fat to seal out the air, packing them in jars that she kept in the coolest part of the cave, where the spring's cold touch ran through the stone. She was paid in necessity. She was paid in her own survival. And slowly, across the turning weeks, the cave that had been a shelter became a home, and the home became abundant in a way that seemed impossible, a way that defied the town's certainty that she would fail. Along the west wall, there were now more than 200 jars. She did not count them, but she knew the number by the space they filled, shelf after shelf of preserved things, vegetables and fruits and mushrooms and rendered fat, glass and ceramic vessels catching the light of her lantern like captured stars. The south wall held the firewood, stacked as high as her head, a cord of it at least, split and seasoned and waiting for the cold. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling in great clusters, sage and yarrow and mint, and the feathery fronds of wild carrot, and they dried slowly in the cool, dry air of the cave, suspended like the chandeliers she had seen once in a church, and they perfumed the entire space with the scent of summer caught and held. She had dug a root cellar deeper into the limestone, a chamber off the back where the natural cold never wavered, where potatoes she'd traded for were packed in sand, where turnips lay in neat rows, where nothing would ever spoil. The cave had become impossible in its abundance, impossible in the way that a single woman's work could create such wealth when the world insisted she had none. And yet the town's mockery had not ceased. If anything, it had intensified as the visible markers of her competence mounted. Mrs. Hargrove had taken to appearing at the general store's front window on days when she knew Elsa would be passing through town for supplies, her elaborate bonnet framing a pinched face, her eyes small and sharp with something that might have been envy or might have been rage. She spoke in the town in a voice pitched to Carrie about the cave woman and her unnatural ways, about how a proper woman would be seeking remarriage or seeking the charity of the county, about how there was something unwomanly in this stubborn sufficiency, and the preacher, whether from conviction or from wanting to please the store owner's wife, had begun to suggest that Elsa should be collected as a matter of Christian duty, a matter of moral concern. The children of the town sometimes ventured to the cave in small packs, throwing pebbles at the mouth, calling out taunts, and Elsa did not respond to them, but neither did she hide. She simply continued her work, and the constancy of it seemed to unsettle them more than any anger could have done. They needed her to break. She would not break. As autumn deepened, she completed the final preparations. She had stitched a hide curtain from the skin of a deer she'd traded labor for, a tanner's waist that the tanner had been willing to give for the price of her work, and she'd treated it with rendered fat to make it pliable, and she mounted it in the mouth of the cave on a frame so that it could be drawn closed. She had built a second inner curtain with an air gap between them, and she had stuffed this gap with dried grass and straw, creating an insulating barrier that would seal the warmth inside when the cold came. The sleeping platform now had a frame around it, half walls of split timber that would hold the quilts close and retain the heat from her body and from the small fire she could keep burning in a brazier near her bed. She had stitched additional clothing from scraps, shirts and undergarments and a heavy wool vest that she'd unraveled from an old coat and re-knit into something that fit her frame. She had worked until the light began to fail earlier each day, until the sun's angle through the cave mouth shifted from nearly horizontal to more steeply angled, and with each passing day, She felt the great shift in the season, felt it in her bones, in the way the animals moved, in the way the light had changed its quality, from the bright burning white of summer to the more golden, more cautious light of autumn. By the time the first real cold came, in late October, the cave was not merely a shelter, but a complete dwelling, a space that was warmer than most of the cabins in the town, a space that breathed with her presence and her work and her intention. The temperature in the deepest part of the cave never dropped below 45 degrees. Even in the depth of winter, she would learn this, held at that level by the earth's own warmth and by the careful arrangement of insulation and the sealed entrance. The hearth had been refinished, the mortar hardened to stone, and it burned clean and hot. The oven was perfected through use, and she could now bake bread with the kind of intuitive knowledge that came only from repetition. The light from the lanterns, she had acquired 3 of them through her labor, cast a honey-colored glow across the stone, caught in the jars, reflected in the standing water of the spring at the rear, and when she lay in her bed under her quilts and looked out at this space she had built with her own hands, she did not feel poor. She felt wealthy beyond measure. And then November came, and with it came the storm. It began on a Tuesday morning with a wind that seemed to arrive from nowhere, a wind that came down from the Canadian north with the voice of something alive and terrible. The sky had been gray for days, but this was different. This was the sky lowering itself like a ceiling, the light failing to something dimmer than dusk, though it was barely mid-morning, and the first snow did not fall so much as explode across the world, driven horizontal by the wind, each flake striking like a tiny shard of glass. Elsa watched it from the mouth of the cave and felt something shift in the air, a pressure that told her this was not an ordinary winter storm, but something vast and implacable, something that would strip the world down to its essentials. In the town of Dresden, the panic began almost immediately. The water pump at the center of Main Street froze solid within hours, and no amount of heating could unfreeze it, so people began melting snow, which was difficult because gathering snow meant going out into the wind, and the wind was becoming something that could knock a person down. The livestock in the barns began to panic, and several animals froze where they stood in the barns that had not been sufficiently sealed. The Hargrove General Store's chimney, which Mrs. Hargrove had always considered a source of pride, had been damaged by the wind in a way that was not immediately apparent until it began to ice over in the severe cold, and by the second day of the storm, the chimney was effectively blocked, and the fires inside began to smoke back into the building. The Hargroves, who had lived with relative comfort, suddenly found themselves crowded with neighbors seeking shelter, seeking the warmth of their stove, and Mrs. Hargrove found herself rationing her supplies in a way she had never imagined necessary. Children cried from the cold in homes where the fires had burned through the available wood. The elderly Mrs. Calloway had to be brought into the preacher's house when her own cabin became uninhabitable, and people began to quietly worry whether they would all survive until spring. The town's dissolution began at the perimeter and spread inward like rot. The blacksmith's forge cooled on the second day when his coal supply exhausted itself, and he stood in his shop watching the fire collapse to ash, understanding that without heat he was merely a man with tools and no purpose. So he barred his doors and joined the queues at the general store, where supplies that had seemed infinite in autumn revealed themselves as finite and dwindling. Families burned their excess furniture, chairs first, their spindles catching flame quickly, then tables, then the wooden frames of beds that would be replaced in spring or never replaced at all. because the warmth had become more necessary than sleep or dignity, and the smell of burning wood overlaid the entire town like a shroud. The school roof collapsed on the third day, a sudden groaning sound followed by the crash of timber and ice, the weight of accumulated snow and sleet finally exceeding the structure's tolerance. And the children were sent home, if home was still accessible, to tend fires and gather fuel instead of reciting lessons. A horse died in the street on the third night, its body driven into a drift by the wind, or perhaps it simply walked into the snow and did not walk back out. And by morning, it had frozen so completely that it became part of the landscape itself, a dark mound that children passed on their way to the pump, refusing to look at it directly. Dr. Hawkins could not reach his patients. The drifts had become impassable even for a man on horseback, and he sat in his office with his medical bag unopened and his conscience open like a wound, listening to the silence and understanding it was the silence of suffering being endured alone in individual rooms where fires were slowly dying and children's fevers were rising and there was nothing to be done. The contrast that Elsa inhabited, the cave that held her and protected her, revealed itself most clearly during the 7th day of the blizzard, when the wind reached such intensity that it sounded like voices screaming from the earth itself. She stood before her hide curtain and examined a small crack that had appeared near the center, the wind now able to find its way through and whisper against her face with an icy insistence, and she took the tallow she had rendered and worked it into the crack with her fingers, allowing it to solidify in the cold, so that within minutes the gap had sealed itself and the wind no longer spoke to her. She ground wheat that she had stored in sealed containers, turning the stone mill slowly so the flour would not overheat and lose its vitality. And she understood as the powder accumulated that she would eat bread tomorrow, real bread, while the town's ovens had gone cold and people were gnawing at hard biscuits and salt pork. She heated water from the spring, carrying it in clay jars and setting it near the fire until steam rose from its surface, and she washed her hair and her body and her hands and her feet, the water warm and clean and entirely within her control, entirely hers to use as she saw fit, not rationed or conserved, but used generously because she had secured enough that generosity was permitted. She read by lantern light, the Bible that Mrs. Calloway had pressed into her hands in those early days before the snow began, a book bound in leather with gilt-edged pages, the stories of suffering and endurance and faith settling into her mind like seeds into soil. And the warmth of her cave and the warmth of the flame and the warmth of the blanket she had layered on her sleeping platform created a cocoon so complete and so perfect that she could almost imagine the world outside did not exist, was something she had dreamed rather than lived through, a bad dream from which she had finally awakened into this shelter and this light and this abundance. The juxtaposition was brutal and clarifying. In the town, cold. In the cave, warmth. In the town, darkness gathering at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. In the cave, light from her lantern and her carefully tended fire. In the town, hunger drawing closer with each hour. In the cave, preserved meat and rendered fat and ground grain and salt crystals gleaming in the cold storage alcove like a promise. She lay on her bed of hides and thought of nothing, or thought of everything, or thought only of the present moment where she was alive and warm and fed, while outside the wind continued its assault and the town continued its slow surrender to the season's merciless mathematics. And in the cave on the hillside, Elsa fed wood to her hearth and felt the warmth rise around her in steady waves. She had been expecting cold. She had prepared for cold, but not this, not the way the temperature dropped past 20 below zero, then 30, then deeper still into the kind of cold that seemed to alter the chemistry of the world, that made breath crystallize in the air, that made flesh begin to fail if exposed for more than minutes. She kept the fire burning steadily, not frantically, but with the knowledge that she had enough wood, that her wood would last, that the abundance she had stockpiled would sustain her. She lit all 3 lanterns, and the light they cast seemed to hold back the darkness in a way that was almost spiritual. The bread she baked twice daily, and the smell of it rising filled the cave and gave her something to do with her hands, something that required her attention in the way that simple survival sometimes needs attention. The oven held heat, and she used it not only for bread, but for heating stones that she wrapped in cloth and placed in her bed to hold warmth through the long nights. The spring at the rear of the cave had not frozen, would not freeze. The earth's warmth kept it running, kept it clear and cold and perfect, and she could drink freely, could use water freely for her simple preparations. She made herb tea in the evenings, steep in the bundles of dried sage and mint that hung from the ceiling, and the steam rose around her face, and she felt the warmth sink into her chest, settle into her bones. She ate from her stores in a way that was measured but not fearful. 1 jar of preserved turnips, 1 section of dried mushroom, 1 portion of rendered fat mixed with preserved berries. The mathematics of it was simple. She knew how many jars she had. She knew what would last until spring, and she maintained her supplies with the care of someone who understood the absolute dependency between consumption and survival. On the 3rd day of the storm, as the wind howled outside in a way that seemed to shake the very stone of the cave, Elsa found herself thinking of the town, thinking of the lives being lived in those inadequate structures, thinking of Mrs. Hargrove in her suddenly cold general store, thinking of the children crying in their insufficient homes. She did not allow herself to feel superior to this. She did not allow herself to feel victorious. Instead, she felt something closer to sadness. Sadness at the stubborn waste of it, at the way people could have chosen to prepare, chosen to believe, chosen to build something that would last. But she did not dwell on this. She returned to her bread, to her fire, to the steady work of simply being warm. On the 4th morning, the wind ceased. The silence was so complete that it seemed to have weight, seemed to press inward from the world beyond the cave. Elsa lay in her bed in the quiet, listening, and she could hear the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth, the subtle drip of water from the spring, her own breath, and nothing else. The absence of wind was so profound that it seemed to be a presence of its own. She rose and pushed open the hide curtain, and the light that poured in was white and brilliant, the reflection of snow from a clear sky, the kind of clarity that comes only after great violence has passed. The snow lay in drifts around the cave mouth, but the ledge in front of the entrance was clear. The wind had scoured it down to the stone, and the sky above was so blue and so utterly empty of clouds that it seemed unreal. She did not immediately make the journey down to the town. She did not feel the pull to it that she had half expected to feel. No urge to prove anything. No need to see the evidence of her own foresight in the suffering of others. Instead, she moved the heavy hide curtain aside and stepped out onto the stone ledge, and she used a stick to break the ice that had formed at the cave mouth, and she swept the snow from the ledge with a broom she had made from bound branches. And then she went back inside. The fire was burning low, and she fed it fresh wood, watching the flames rise and dance and fill the space with warmth and light. She mixed flour and water and began to shape bread, her hands moving in the familiar motion, and she set the loaf in the oven, and the heat met her face in that exhalation that she had come to love. And she closed the door and sat back and waited for the bread to rise in the darkness of the oven to transform into something that would sustain her. The cave smelled of warm bread and dried sage. The jars on the shelves caught the light and seemed to hold it. The lantern burned steady in the darkness, and outside the world was white and silent and new. And Elsa Brannock sat in the warmth of all she had built, and understood that she was sufficient unto herself, that she needed no one's permission to survive, that everything she had been made not to spite the world, but to survive it, to endure it, to pass through it with dignity and care. She had built something real from nothing, not from pride, not from hardship, but from the simple knowledge that survival is not a thing given, but a thing made, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, with the patience and precision that all real things demand. If this story has meant something to you, the kind of testament to what human hands can build when given only time and intention, consider walking alongside us for the stories still to come. The stories written in the earth and the air and the fire that transforms raw things into sustenance. The smoke rising from the hillside would drift down toward the town eventually. People would smell it and know that someone had survived what they could not survive, had built what they could not imagine building. And some of them would understand this as a kind of triumph, and some of them would understand it as an indictment, and Elsa would feel neither. She would only feel the warmth of the fire, the rightness of the bread, the steady beating of her own heart in the darkness. There are more stories like this one, waiting on the ridge, waiting in the silence that comes after great violence, waiting for someone who understands that survival is not a matter of luck or grace, but of work and knowledge and the absolute refusal to surrender to what others believe you cannot do. You are welcome to walk there with us, to see what hands can make, to understand what becomes possible when someone decides that they will not break, that they will not fail, that they will build their own way forward into the dark.